Hello everyone, I am Rizadel Delica. I'm a student in UPOU University, taking up Master in Development Communication. Today I'm going to present to you my research proposal entitled #ResilientPH, the use of social media in disaster risk reduction in the Philippines. Here's the outline of my presentation. I'll start it with an introduction. Here I'm going to discuss about the research gaps, research questions, and the objectives of the study. Then it will be followed by a summary of the review of related literature, then the theoretical framework, conceptual framework, methodology, then the research instrument. #YolandaPH, #RescuePH, #ReliefPH. These hashtags, flooded the social media after Super Typhoon Yolanda struck the country in November 8, 2013. Who wouldn't know Yolanda? Yolanda, internationally known as Typhoon Haiyan, caused massive devastation to the Philippines, making it the worst disaster in the country's history. National Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Council reported a total death of 6,300 individuals, 28,688 injured, and 1,062 missing. It has also brought massive damage to the country with an estimated amount of $2 billion. Until now, the memories of Typhoon Yolanda is vivid in the minds of the victims as they are still in the process of rehabilitating their communities. But Yolanda is just one of the many natural disasters that devastated the country. We all know that we are not a stranger to a disaster because Philippines is located in the Pacific Ring of Fire and in the typhoon belt. So every now and then we experience a disaster. This has crippled the development of the country. One of the UN 17 Sustainable Development Goals tackles ways to combat climate change and its impacts. It addresses the issue by outlining specific targets like strengthening countries' resilience and increasing human and institutional capacity in climate change mitigation through education and raising awareness. It targets specifically the increased capacity of people in the least developed countries. So in this study, I'm going to look at how social media can be used in achieving these targets. This is a relevant study, especially now that the world is getting warmer and the effects of climate change are getting worse. Recent studies show a growing interest in the use of social media in emergencies and disaster risk reduction. However, Vicualite argued that the views about the use of social media in disaster response, as well as recognition of its usefulness, are still highly fragmented. There is a need to do an in-depth research in the field to add to the existing knowledge on the use of social media in disaster. So I'm going to discuss about the gaps in the research. Most of the studies conducted focus on the use of social media during and after a disaster. Although there are attempts to discuss the use of social media in disaster risk reduction, like that of Lindsay, Alexander, further research must be employed. It is important to discuss about the motivation of the public on the use of social media for disaster. In addition, Faustino argues that research on social media during disasters primarily focus on one media type, which is Twitter. So there's a need to have further research on the role played by different social media platforms during disasters. Also, how LGUs and NGOs can capitalize on social media's benefits. There is also lack of national samples or field experiments and surveys. There's also a need to discuss about the comparison of the importance of social media versus other media during disasters, and also linking disaster type to a certain social media, because as I have told you, most of the research is done or focused on Twitter. Faustino also argued that there's a need to do longitudinal studies. The study will try to fill in the research gaps. The research will try to identify the best uses of social media in disaster risk reduction in the Philippines. It will seek to answer the following questions. What are the types and functions of social media? How are they used before, during, and after a disaster? How do NGOs use social media in advancing disaster risk reduction? What are the main benefits of using social media? And how can LGUs and NGOs take advantage of these benefits? The aim of this study is to identify the best uses of social media in disaster risk reduction. To achieve this aim, the following objectives are pursued. Explain the roles played by various media platforms in the public's communication activities before, during, and after a disaster. Describe ways in which social media are used by NGOs in the Philippines in advancing disaster risk reduction through a case study. Lastly, to analyze and evaluate the ways in which social media can be used by LGUs and NGOs in disaster risk reduction. Some of the related literature um, on social media use in disaster risk reduction. In the recent years, social media has been used in various natural disasters, according to Viculite, and individuals and communities have used social media to warn people of a coming calamity, update loved ones of their conditions, and to mobilize people to provide donations for relief. Now, some of the studies I'm going to look at are the studies of Paladin, Mills, Dafty, Wilson, Goldfine, in terms of the focus of the study. So both the study of Paladin et al. And Mills, Chen, Lee, and Rao talks about the usefulness of Twitter in a disaster. So they focus mainly on one media platform, which is Twitter. Dufty, on the other hand, focused on how social media can build community disaster resilience. So this is where disaster risk reduction come into the picture. Also, the studies like Wilson, Goldfine look at the use of social media during and after a disaster. So, by looking at the literature, not much is studied on how social media can be used in disaster risk reduction. Also, I have reviewed some of the theoretical or conceptual framework used in different researches on um, social media and disaster. Faustino, Liu, and Jin, and also Paladin, Ramos, and Capulong Reyes have used the theory on uses and gratification by Katz. And Goldfine, on the other hand, used attribution theory, situational crisis, communication theory, contingency theory, image repair theory, which are all used to analyze um, how organizations respond to a disaster. Okay, next is Wilson, which used the IOS framework, or in out seeker provider. And in my study, I'm going to use this uses and gratification theory. Now, in terms of methodology, Wilson used qualitative case study. Paladin, Ramos, Capulong Reyes used quantitative survey, and Viculite used mixed approach, which is qualitative content analysis and quantitative. Two theoretical frameworks will be used in the study. One is disaster risk theory from the pressure and release model of Wisner. This will provide a framework in understanding the nature of disaster. In summary, the theory explains that the increase in hazard and vulnerability and low capacity result to high risk of disaster, while the increased capacity of individual, community, and environment can reduce the impact of the hazards, hence lower risk. This will be explained further in the conceptual framework. And also, I will use the uses and gratification theory to understand media consumption motivations. So here's the conceptual framework. In disaster risk theory, it is discussed how the meeting of vulnerability and hazard cause disaster. This can be better understood through this illustration. It is adapted from Kahn's study. The progression of vulnerability from underlying causes, to dynamic pressure to unsafe condition plus hazards create pressure which leads to disaster. Some examples of underlying causes are limited access to resources, illness, sex, disabilities, poverty, etc. For dynamic pressure, it is the lack of institutions, education, training, environmental degradation. And for the unsafe conditions, we're looking at the dangerous location, low income levels, lack of disaster preparedness. For hazards, we have natural and man-made. So in this pressure and release model, it is explained that in order for the pressure to be relieved, there is a need to decrease vulnerability and increase capacity of the people at risk. So that's what we're going to look at here. So risk equals hazard times vulnerability divided by capacity or minus capacity. This is an illustration by van der Linde. He created a diagram that explains this equation. So this explains that the increase in hazard, vulnerability, low capacity equals higher risk, while decrease in hazard and vulnerability and increase in capacity would result to lower risk. Now we're going to look at how to increase the capacity. So in my study, my focus is social media. How can social media be used, or how can it be a potential mean to increase the capacity of the people? So now I've created this conceptual framework adapted from the model on disaster risk reduction of Oxley. So in here, social media can be a potential means to build capacities of the people and community at risk. And social media can also be means for the government and non-government organizations to do climate change initiatives. So here in this diagram, through social media, the pressure of the impacts of hazards can be relieved. So basically, social media is seen as a means to reduce disaster risk. Now let's look at the methodology used in the study. The study will employ both qualitative and quantitative research methods in order to understand how social media can be used in disaster risk reduction. The study will use qualitative research through a case study to understand how social media are used by non-government organizations in the Philippines in advancing disaster risk reduction. It will also use a quantitative approach which will be used to explain the roles played by various media platforms in the Filipinos' communication activities before, during, and after a disaster. So the respondents will be the Philippine internet users. Currently, there is a total of 44,478,808 internet users in the Philippines, according to Internet Life Stats. So a survey will be conducted with a sampling size of 96 respondents. This is calculated based on the total population of internet users in the Philippines, with a confidence level of 95% and a confidence interval of 10. Descriptive analysis will be used to measure the answers to the questionnaire. The research instruments that will be used are structured survey questionnaires and semi-structured interviews for the case study. The study will also need reading of secondary documents. So the survey questionnaire will look primarily on how internet users in the Philippines use social media before, during, and after a disaster. So it will look at their motivations and all. Also for the interview, it will be semi-structured to give respondents opportunity to freely express their minds. Okay, that's it. Thank you very much for listening. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask. Bye!